The impact felt like taking a sandbag directly to the sternum. 60 pounds of ribs, matted fur, and manic desperation slammed into Morgan before she could even raise her rifle. The German Shepherd didn't bite. She dug her cracked claws into Morgan's Kevlar, burying her snout against Morgan's neck, letting out a sound that wasn't a bark, but a jagged human sob. The air in the district tasted of pulverized concrete and old copper. It coated the back of Morgan's throat, a gritty paste she'd been swallowing for the last 6 hours. She leaned her shoulder against the sun-baked mud wall of the alleyway, letting the ceramic plates of her vest bear the weight for a second. The heat was an absolute physical presence, pressing down on her neck like a hot iron. Sweat pooled at the small of her back, chafing against the rigid nylon of her gear. Around her, the city was dead, or at least it was holding its breath. The clearance operation had moved 2 grid squares east, leaving Morgan's fire team on a static perimeter watch in a neighborhood that had been bombed back to the Stone Age. 30 mics until exfil. Bennett's voice crackled over the radio, flat and bored. Stay frosty. Morgan didn't bother keying her mic to reply. She just shifted her grip on her rifle, her gloves sticky with sweat and rifle grease. Her eyes swept the broken street. Rebar jutted from collapsed roofs like snapped bones. A rusted-out sedan sat in the center of the road, stripped of anything valuable, baking in the relentless midday sun. Then came the sound. It was subtle at first, a frantic scratching, the soft thud-thud-thud of padded feet hitting the broken asphalt. Morgan's thumb hovered over the selector switch of her M4. She stepped out from the shadow of the wall, cutting the angle, the muzzle of her weapon leading her eyes. A shape darted out from behind the rusted sedan. It wasn't a combatant. It was a dog. But this wasn't one of the feral, coyote-like mutts that usually roamed the ruined streets, surviving on trash and corpses. This was a German Shepherd, or at least the ghost of one. The animal was gaunt, its hip bones jutting sharply against the dull, dust-choked coat. One ear was torn in a jagged V-shape, the cartilage exposed. It moved with a frantic, uneven gait, head darting wildly, sniffing the air. Morgan lowered her weapon a fraction. A stray. She'd seen 100 of them. She felt a brief, dull flicker of pity, instantly smothered by the overwhelming exhaustion in her own limbs. Keep moving, dog, she thought. Nothing here for you. But the dog didn't keep moving. It stopped dead in the middle of the street, its dark, sunken eyes locking onto Morgan's silhouette. For a second, neither of them moved. The silence of the ruined street stretched out, heavy and thick. Then, the dog charged. It didn't run with aggression. It ran with a blind, panicked velocity. Morgan tensed, raising the barrel, her mind instantly calculating the threat. Rabies? A rigged explosive vest strapped to a local stray? It had happened before. "Hey, get back!" she barked, her voice harsh, cracking through the dry air. The dog didn't flinch. It closed the distance in seconds. Morgan braced for a bite, stepping back, bringing her knee up to strike. But the dog didn't go for her legs. It launched itself upward. The collision was clumsy and violent. 60 pounds of desperate animal slammed into Morgan's chest. The air left Morgan's lungs in a sharp grunt. She stumbled backward, her boots scraping desperately against the loose gravel to keep from going down. Her rifle swung out on its sling, banging painfully against her thigh. The German Shepherd didn't snap. It didn't growl. Instead, it wrapped its front legs around Morgan's torso, burying its dusty, hot face into the space between Morgan's helmet and her collarbone. The animal was vibrating, a high-frequency tremble that radiated through the ceramic plates of Morgan's armor. "Jesus, get off!" Morgan gasped, shoving a gloved hand against the dog's ribs. The skin there felt paper-thin, stretched tight over the bone. She managed to push the dog off her chest. The shepherd hit the dirt with a heavy thud, but immediately scrambled back to Morgan's boots. It let out a sound that made the hairs on Morgan's arms stand up, a sharp, rattling whine, desperate and suffocating. Morgan looked down, her chest heaving. The dog was looking up at her, tongue lolling, panting heavily. The stench of it was overpowering, wet dust, stale urine, and the undeniable metallic tang of old blood. That was when Morgan saw it. As the dog panted, the intact ear swiveled back. Inside the pink, dirt-caked flesh of the oracle was a faded blue tattoo, a barcode and a serial string, K-9-7 7A. Morgan's stomach dropped. This wasn't a local stray. She crouched down, the joints of her knees popping in protest. She reached out slowly. The dog didn't flinch away. Instead, it aggressively shoved its head into her palm, nearly knocking her off balance. Morgan rubbed her thumb over the tattoo, wiping away a smear of grime. "You're a contractor's dog," Morgan murmured, her voice losing its edge. "Or you were." When the private military companies pulled out of the sector 3 months ago, the withdrawal had been a chaotic mess. Equipment was left to rust. Vehicles were abandoned, and apparently, assets were left behind. Anger, cold and sharp, flared in Morgan's chest. She had a deep, cynical disdain for the suits who ran the PMC contracts, treating a war zone like a spreadsheet. They'd likely written the animal off as a lost piece of inventory. Cheaper to leave her than to fly her out. "Sorry, girl," Morgan said, her voice flattening out. The brief burst of empathy was a liability. She stood up, checking her rifle, adjusting her sling. "I can't do anything for you. I'm just a trigger puller on a clock." She turned to walk back to her shaded spot against the wall. The dog grabbed the hem of Morgan's uniform trousers in its teeth. Morgan froze. The grip wasn't aggressive, but it was firm. The dog pulled, backing away, dragging Morgan's heavy boot a few inches across the gravel. "Hey, leave it!" Morgan commanded, using the sharp, authoritative tone drill instructors hammered into them. The dog let go, sitting back on its haunches. But the moment Morgan took a step toward the wall, the dog was there again, blocking her path. It whined, a loud, grating sound, then turned, trotted 3 yards down the alley, and stopped. It looked back over its shoulder at Morgan. It was the most universal language in the world. "Follow me." "No," Morgan said aloud to the empty street. "Absolutely not." The dog let out a sharp bark, pawing at the dirt, then trotted another 2 yards away. It looked back again. The dark brown eyes were wide, the whites showing, manic with urgency. "Hayes, what's your status?" Bennett's voice scratched through the earpiece. "Thought I heard a bark." Morgan stared down the alley. The sun was baking the tops of her shoulders. Her feet throbbed. She was exhausted, cynical, and wanted nothing more than to sit in an air-conditioned transport plane and drink lukewarm water. She was not a rescue worker. She was a SEAL. Her job was to hold the line, break things, and leave. "Negative, Bennett," Morgan lied, her thumb pressing the push-to-talk button. "Just some debris shifting in the wind." "Copy that. 10 mics. Don't go wandering." Morgan let her hand drop. The shepherd was still standing there, 10 yards away now, its tail tucked tightly between its legs, its entire body tense as a coiled spring. Morgan looked at the dog. The dog looked at Morgan. If I walk away, Morgan thought, this animal dies here. starves or catches a bullet from a nervous local. She had seen a lot of death. She had walked past bleeding insurgents, weeping civilians, and shattered infrastructure. You had to build a wall in your head, a thick, brutal partition, to keep the empathy from bleeding into your operational capacity. You couldn't care about the collateral, or it would drown you. But there was something about the sheer betrayal of it. A soldier, bred and trained to trust humans completely, used as a tool to sniff out IEDs or clear buildings, and then dumped like a broken flashlight when the budget ran out. It picked at a scab in Morgan's mind. It offended her sense of order. "Damn it," Morgan muttered, the words scraping out of her dry throat. "I'm going to get court-martialed for a stray." She took a step forward. The dog instantly turned and began to trot down the alley, navigating the debris with practiced ease. "Keep it slow," Morgan hissed, raising her rifle to a low, ready position, her eyes scanning the rooftops and upper windows. They moved deeper into the residential block. The shadows grew longer here, the buildings huddled closer together. The air was dead, smelling of raw sewage and the sour, pervasive scent of ancient dust. Glass crunched loudly under Morgan's boots, an agonizingly loud sound in the quiet. The shepherd moved with purpose, but it was clearly struggling. Every few steps, its hind legs would tremble and give out slightly, a momentary buckle before it caught itself. The pads of its feet left faint, dusty red smears on the jagged concrete. It was running on fumes, driven entirely by whatever frantic instinct was burning inside its skull. "Slow down," Morgan whispered, more to herself than the dog. Her heart was beating a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. This was a tactical nightmare. She was off her assigned perimeter, moving alone through uncleared territory, following a half-dead animal into a blind spot. They turned a corner into a narrow courtyard. The space was choked with the ruins of a collapsed balcony. Slabs of concrete the size of dining tables lay pitched at awkward angles, tangled in thick webs of rusted rebar. The dog didn't hesitate. It scrambled over a pile of cinder blocks, its claws slipping, and squeezed into a dark, jagged fissure between two massive slabs of the collapsed floor. Morgan stopped at the edge of the rubble. She crouched, peering into the crack. It was pitch black inside. The smell emanating from the hole was thick and foul. Damp earth, mildew, and the sharp tang of decay. "No way," Morgan said softly. "I'm not crawling in there. That whole thing is a widowmaker." She reached up and tapped her radio. "Bennett, I've got eyes on a potential cache site, offset 50 meters north of my POs. Investigating." It was another lie, a cover in case she needed a reason for breaking protocol. "Roger, Hayes. Don't take all day. Exfil birds are spinning up." Morgan unclipped her helmet, setting it quietly on the dirt. The tight confines of the collapsed concrete wouldn't allow for the bulky Kevlar. She pulled her flashlight from her vest, clicking it on. The harsh white beam cut through the darkness of the fissure, illuminating swirling motes of dust. From deep inside the rubble, the shepherd whined. It wasn't a demanding sound anymore. It was a plea, a soft broken whimper that echoed off the concrete. Morgan squeezed her eyes shut for a second, fighting the internal war. Logic screamed at her to walk away. The building could shift. An insurgent could be hiding in the dark. It was a dog. Just a dog. She opened her eyes, letting out a long, slow breath. "You are an idiot, Hayes," she whispered to herself. Morgan laid flat on her stomach, the hot gravel biting into her elbows. She slung her rifle around to her back, gripping the flashlight in her left hand, her sidearm drawn in her right. Holding her breath, she began to pull herself into the fissure. The transition from the blinding heat of the sun to the claustrophobic darkness of the rubble was instantaneous. The air inside the collapsed basement was 10 degrees cooler, but heavy, thick, with the smell of wet rot. Morgan army crawled, the ceramic plates of her vest scraping loudly against the concrete ceiling just inches above her spine. The space was terrifyingly tight. If the slab shifted even a millimeter, it would crush her flat. The silence was absolute, save for the grit grinding under her uniform and the raspy, struggling breaths of the dog somewhere ahead. "Hey," Morgan whispered, her voice sounding muffled and flat in the tight space. "Where are you?" She swept the flashlight beam side to side. The beam caught the jagged edges of torn drywall, exposed PVC pipes, and the twisted metal frame of what used to be a bed. Then, the beam caught the reflection of two yellow-green eyes. The shepherd was huddled in the furthest corner of the cavernous space, backed up against a relatively intact concrete foundation wall. Morgan pulled herself forward, her shoulders burning from the awkward angle. She closed the distance, the smell of the dog growing overpowering. As she got closer, she saw the setup. It wasn't just a hiding spot. It was a nest. Scraped together from torn fiberglass insulation, shredded pieces of a dirty rug, and, Morgan swallowed hard, an old, blood-stained jacket bearing a faded American flag patch. The dog had built a shallow bowl in the dirt. The shepherd wasn't looking at Morgan anymore. She was looking down at the nest, nudging something with her bloody nose. Morgan shifted the flashlight beam down. At first, they just looked like lumps of dirty, moving lint. But as the bright light hit them, the lumps began to squirm frantically, emitting tiny, high-pitched, mewling sounds. Like rats. There were 4 of them. Puppies. They couldn't have been more than a week old. Their eyes were sealed shut, their ears plastered flat against their oversized skulls. They were covered in a fine layer of gray concrete dust, blind, helpless, and frantically rooting around in the insulation, searching for a mother who had nothing left to give them. The shepherd looked up at Morgan. The frantic, manic energy was gone, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it seemed to emanate from the dog's bones. The mother let out a long, shuddering sigh, resting her chin on the edge of the blood-stained jacket, her eyes heavy. "Please," the posture said. "I can't carry them anymore." Morgan stared at the blind, wriggling bodies. A heavy, suffocating knot tightened in her throat. The sheer, brutal unfairness of it all crashed into her. This dog, abandoned by a military machine, starving and dying in a ruined city, had spent her last ounces of energy not running for her own survival, but searching for a human, any human in a uniform, to hand off her burden. She had recognized the silhouette of the gear. She remembered the people who used to take care of her. "Oh, God," Morgan breathed, lowering her sidearm and holstering it. She let her head drop against her forearms for a second, feeling the damp, dirty earth against her skin. She was a SEAL. She carried 60 pounds of lethal equipment. She was trained to endure sleep deprivation, hypothermia, and gunfire. She was not equipped to carry 4 fragile, blind lives that fit into the palm of her hand. The radio in her ear hissed. "Hayes, exfil is 05 mics. Fall back to Rally Point Alpha, now." Morgan didn't answer. She sat up slightly, the back of her vest brushing the concrete ceiling. She reached out, taking off her left glove, and touched the mother dog's head. The fur was coarse and coated in grit. The dog leaned into the touch, letting out a soft, barely audible groan. "Okay," Morgan whispered, the cynicism burning away. leaving only a raw, stubborn resolve. "Okay, Mama, I got them." Morgan unzipped the front of her combat shirt, pulling out the empty dump pouch rolled at her waist. It was meant for spent magazines. It was going to have to do. Carefully, her calloused, dirt-stained fingers reached into the nest. She picked up the first puppy. It was shockingly warm, its tiny heart vibrating rapidly against her thumb. It squeaked, a pathetic, reedy sound, as she lowered it gently into the nylon pouch. She grabbed the second, then the third, then the fourth. They piled on top of each other at the bottom of the pouch, a writhing, squeaking mass of life. Morgan looked at the mother. "You're coming too," she commanded quietly. The shepherd didn't move. Her eyes were half closed. Morgan grabbed the scruff of the dog's neck, not gently, but with firm, undeniable intent. "I said, you are coming too. I didn't crawl into this grave to leave you here. Up." The dog whined, her legs trembling violently as she tried to obey the command. She managed to push herself up into a low crouch, her breathing ragged. "Good girl," Morgan said, her voice tight. "Now we crawl." With 4 puppies secured against her stomach, a half-dead German shepherd trailing her boots, and the weight of the entire ruined city pressing down on the concrete above them, Morgan began the agonizing crawl back toward the light. The reverse crawl was a lesson in claustrophobic agony. Moving backward meant Morgan couldn't see the jagged edges of the ruptured concrete before they caught on her gear. The heavy ceramic trauma plates embedded in her chest rig scraped relentlessly against the collapsed ceiling, sending tiny, suffocating cascades of gray dust into her eyes and nose. Every time she exhaled, she inhaled a lungful of pulverized mortar. It tasted faintly of lime and old rot. Against her stomach, the dump pouch was a localized center of chaotic movement. The 4 blind puppies were a squirming, uncoordinated mass of heat and sharp little claws. They squeaked in a continuous, reedy chorus, a sound that drilled directly into the base of Morgan's skull. She had to keep her hips elevated just enough to avoid crushing them against the debris-littered floor. But keeping her core bridged like that sent fiery cramps shooting up through her lower back. Her muscles screamed in protest, flooded with lactic acid from the day's relentless patrols. "Come on," she grunted, her voice tight, a harsh rasp in the narrow darkness. She didn't look back to see if the mother was following. She couldn't afford to stop and check. The only evidence that the German shepherd was still behind her was the wet, rattling sound of the animal's labored breathing and the occasional scrape of broken claws against the floorboards. "Hayes, 3 mics." Bennett's voice abruptly cut through her earpiece, the sudden burst of static making her flinch, slamming her helmetless head into a low-hanging piece of rebar. Pain flared across her scalp, sharp and white-hot. "I'm moving, Bennett," Morgan hissed, squeezing her eyes shut to blink away the sting. She tasted a metallic tang at the back of her throat. She shifted her elbows, digging the reinforced fabric of her uniform into the loose gravel, and pulled herself back another 2 feet. "I'm inbound." "You sound out of breath. You hit?" The radio crackled with a sudden shift in tone, the bored professionalism replaced by a sudden sharp edge of adrenaline. "Negative. Just navigating a tight spot. Stand by." She kicked her boots backward and felt nothing but empty air. The entrance. She pushed herself out, sliding awkwardly on her stomach until her torso cleared the heavy concrete slab. The transition back into the punishing glare of the midday sun was brutal. The light pierced her retinas, and the heat immediately clamped down on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She rolled onto her side, gasping for the dry, dead air of the alleyway, her chest heaving. The dump pouch shifted dangerously, and she instinctively threw a gloved hand over it to keep the blind passengers contained. Morgan scrambled to her knees, reaching back into the dark fissure. For an agonizingly long second, nothing happened. The hole remained empty. Then a snout appeared. The shepherd emerged slowly, her head low, her ears pinned flat against her skull. The bright sunlight seemed to disorient her. She blinked heavily, her legs trembling so violently that her knees knocked together. She looked worse in the full light of day. Her coat was completely stripped of its natural oils, resembling a piece of dirty, discarded carpeting. The skin stretched over her ribs looked impossibly thin, practically translucent in places, and a fresh scrape on her flank was oozing a slow, sluggish line of dark blood, where she had dragged herself against the rebar. She stood at the edge of the rubble and stared at Morgan, swaying slightly on her paws. "Let's go," Morgan said, standing up. Her knees popped. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. She grabbed her helmet from the dirt, jamming it onto her head and buckling the chin strap without bothering to wipe away the dust. She slung her rifle back to her front, the familiar weight settling across her chest, pressing uncomfortably against the pouch of squirming bodies. The dog didn't move. She just stared at the dump pouch at Morgan's waist, letting out a single, pathetic whine. "They're right here," Morgan said, tapping the pouch. "But we have to walk. Now." She turned and began to jog toward the rally point. It was a calculated risk, leaving her flank exposed to an unknown animal. But the clock was screaming in her head. She made it 10 yards down the broken street before she realized there was no sound of paws behind her. Morgan stopped, gritting her teeth, and looked back. The shepherd had taken exactly 3 steps before her hindquarters had simply given out. She was sitting awkwardly in the center of the debris field, her front legs splayed wide in a desperate attempt to keep her chest off the ground. She was panting rapidly, her tongue completely dry, a pale, unhealthy pink. She looked at Morgan, and the sheer resignation in those sunken brown eyes hit Morgan like a physical blow. The adrenaline that had fueled the dog's manic charge earlier was completely gone. She had transferred her burden. She was done fighting. "No," Morgan muttered, the cynicism evaporating into a sudden raw flare of anger. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to hand off your mess and just die on me. That's not how this works." She stalked back to the dog. The animal didn't even flinch as Morgan approached, just watched her with that same hollow, empty stare. Morgan slung her rifle behind her back again. She didn't think about the hygiene of it. She didn't think about the ticks, or the potential for disease, or the sheer absurdity of a Tier 1 operator turning herself into a pack mule for a stray. She just acted on the stubborn, irrational fury that demanded things not end this way. Morgan bent down, sliding her arms under the dog's chest and hind legs. The smell was staggering up close, a pungent mixture of infected wounds, stale urine, and severe dehydration. As she lifted, the dog let out a sharp, surprised yelp, but lacked the energy to thrash. She weighed less than 50 pounds, but it was dead weight, awkward and shifting. "Hold still," Morgan ordered, adjusting her grip. She hoisted the animal up, settling the dog's bony ribs against her chest, right above the dump pouch. The dog's head lolled over Morgan's right shoulder, hot, ragged breath ghosting against the exposed skin of Morgan's neck. "Hayes, visual on the birds." Bennett's voice cut through the comms. "Where the hell are you?" "I am 30 seconds out," Morgan barked back, her lungs burning as she began to run. Running with 60 pounds of combat gear was standard. Running with an extra 50 pounds of dying dog while trying not to crush the 4 puppies secured to her waist was a logistical nightmare. Her center of gravity was entirely compromised. Her boots slammed unevenly onto the cracked asphalt, jarring her spine with every step. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes and cutting clean tracks through the thick layer of grime on her cheeks. She turned the final corner, the ruins of the neighborhood giving way to a wide, bombed-out intersection that served as their temporary landing zone. The sound hit her before the wind did. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of twin rotors chopped through the heavy air, a violent, concussive noise that vibrated in Morgan's teeth. An MH-60 Black Hawk was already touching down, kicking up a massive, blinding brownout of dirt and trash. Through the swirling dust, Morgan saw Bennett taking a knee near the perimeter, his rifle up, scanning the sight lines. As Morgan broke through the dust cloud, running awkwardly, her arms full of matted fur, Bennett lowered his weapon, his visor masking his eyes, but his posture radiating pure, unadulterated confusion. Morgan didn't stop. She pushed past him, aiming directly for the open side door of the Black Hawk. The crew chief, a bulky guy named Miller, was leaning out, waving them in. As Morgan approached, Miller's hand froze mid-wave. Even through the tinted visor of his flight helmet, Morgan could feel the glare. He keyed his mic, his voice blasting through the internal comms channel Morgan was tied into. "Whoa, whoa! Hayes, what the hell is that?" Miller shouted over the deafening roar of the turbines. "We are not a veterinary medevac. Drop the stray." Morgan reached the skid, the downwash threatening to knock her off balance. She turned her back to the wind, shielding the dog's face from the flying debris. "She's a K-9 asset," Morgan lied, her voice projected at maximum volume to pierce the noise. She didn't care if it was a court-martial offense. She was already entirely committed to the lie. Left behind by the contractors, she's got intel. It was the stupidest thing she had ever said in her military career. A dog with intel. But in the chaos of an extraction, under fire or not, momentum was everything. Miller hesitated, looking from Morgan to the ruined, bony creature in her arms, and then down to the bulging dump pouch at her waist that was currently squirming violently. "Are those rats?" Miller yelled, pointing at her stomach. Puppies!" Morgan screamed back, stepping onto the skid and shoving her way into the troop compartment before Miller could physically block her. "Now get us off this rock." Bennett piled in a second later, shaking his head, slamming his fist against the bulkhead to signal the pilots. The helicopter immediately banked hard to the left, the engine pitched screaming higher as they tore away from the broken city, leaving the dust and the ghosts behind. Morgan collapsed onto the webbed seating, the dog still clutched tightly in her arms. The interior of the Black Hawk smelled fiercely of JP-8 aviation fuel, hot electronics, and the sharp tang of sweat. It was a familiar, comforting stench, a sensory cue that usually signaled survival and the end of a long rotation. Today, it just felt suffocating. The helicopter pitched upward, the sudden shift in G-force pressing Morgan heavily into the jump seat. She didn't let go of the German Shepherd. The dog lay limply across Morgan's lap. Its eyes rolled back slightly, showing crescents of yellowish white. The rattling sound in the animal's chest had grown wetter, shallower. "Jackson!" Morgan yelled over the deafening scream of the transmission. She kicked her boot out, tapping the shin of the team medic sitting across from her. Jackson, a stocky man with dirt crusted into the deep lines around his eyes, looked up from his data pad. He saw the dog, looked at Morgan, and frowned, shaking his head. He tapped his helmet, indicating the comms. "Hayes, I treat trigger pullers, not livestock." Jackson's voice came through crisp in her ear, laced with a heavy dose of cynical fatigue. "What do you want me to do with a half-dead street mutt?" "She's a contractor K-9, Morgan replied, her tone leaving zero room for debate. The lie was hardening into reality in her mind. "She's extremely dehydrated. Hit her with a bag." Jackson stared at her for a long, silent moment. In the tight-knit world of the teams, you didn't question a teammate's call in the field, even if it bordered on the psychotic. With a heavy dramatic sigh that translated perfectly through the microphone, Jackson unbuckled his harness and crab-walked across the vibrating floor of the aircraft. He knelt in front of Morgan, pulling a roll of medical tape and a bag of lactated ringers from his aid bag. He didn't offer any gentle words or soft pats. He was a mechanic working on a broken machine. He grabbed the dog's front leg. The animal didn't even twitch. "Veins are flat. Completely blown," Jackson muttered, swabbing a patch of skin on the foreleg with an iodine wipe. The stark yellow chemical stained the dog's pale, dust-choked skin. "I'm gonna have to go deep. It's gonna hurt." "Do it," Morgan said. Jackson uncapped a large-bore needle. He didn't hesitate. He drove the needle into the vein with the same brutal efficiency he used on shrapnel victims. The dog let out a sharp, broken yelp, its body thrashing weakly for a fraction of a second. Morgan clamped her gloved hand gently but firmly over the dog's muzzle. I know," Morgan whispered, leaning her head down so her visor clicked against the dog's ear. "Just take the pain. It's the only way out." Jackson taped the line down, hanging the fluid bag from a carabiner hooked to the ceiling webbing. He squeezed the bag, forcing the hydration rapidly into the animal's collapsed vascular system. "That's all she gets. I'm not wasting meds on her." He crawled back to his seat, deliberately avoiding eye contact with Morgan. Morgan sat back, the vibration of the floorboard seeping into her exhausted bones. She looked down at her waist. The dump pouch was still moving. Carefully, she unzipped the top of the pouch. The 4 blind puppies were piled on top of each other, exhausted from the heat and the motion. But they were alive. They smelled like warm milk and wet earth. She reached in, pulling one out. It fit entirely in the palm of her hand. Its tiny nose twitched, blindly rooting against the Kevlar of her vest, searching for a mother it couldn't find. Morgan looked at the mother dog. The IV fluid was running fast, but the animal still looked like a corpse. The ribs rose and fell in a shallow, erratic rhythm. Morgan placed the puppy gently near the mother's nose. The German Shepherd didn't open her eyes, but her nostrils flared. A low, soft puff of air escaped her snout. Slowly, agonizingly, she lifted her heavy head just a fraction of an inch and bumped her wet nose against the puppy. The puppy squeaked, instantly turning and burying its face into the mother's matted fur, searching blindly for sustenance that wasn't there. A tight, uncomfortable knot formed in the center of Morgan's chest. She had spent years conditioning herself to view the world in binary terms, threats and targets, assets and liabilities. You didn't survive in her line of work by dragging dead weight. You survived by cutting it loose. But looking at the broken animal in her lap, Morgan felt the cold, hard logic crack. The military-industrial machine had brought this dog to a war zone, demanded its loyalty, exploited its instincts, and then abandoned it to starve in the rubble when the math no longer added up. It was a perfect, brutal microcosm of everything Morgan hated about the war. By pulling the dog out of that hole, Morgan wasn't just saving an animal. She was aggressively rejecting the absolute sheer apathy of the system. It was a tiny, insignificant rebellion in a conflict built on massive structural failures, but it was hers. Bennett leaned over, his shoulder bumping hers. He looked down at the dog, then at the squirming pouch. "You know Base Command is going to force you to put them down, right?" Bennett said quietly over the internal comms. "No unquarantined animals on the FOB standard operating procedure." Morgan didn't look at him. She reached into her pouch, pulled out a small foil-wrapped packet of a high-calorie survival paste, and ripped the top off with her teeth. She squeezed a tiny dab onto her gloved finger and rubbed it gently against the puppy's mouth. SOP doesn't apply to active assets, Morgan replied, her voice flat, staring blankly at the metal bulkhead across from her. Morgan, she's not an asset. She's a stray. You can't just invent a cover story. Watch me, Morgan said. She wiped a smear of dirt off the mother dog's faded blue ear tattoo with her thumb. Her name is K-9-77A. She's a highly specialized explosive detection asset. And she is coming home with me. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with my rifle. Bennett stared at her for a long second, then slowly shook his head. A faint, cynical smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth beneath his visor. You are completely out of your mind, Hayes. Probably, Morgan admitted, the tension draining out of her shoulders. She looked down as the mother dog finally let out a long, deep sigh, her head resting entirely on Morgan's thigh, the tension finally leaving her ruined body as the fluids did their work. The helicopter banked again, catching the dying rays of the sun as it sped back toward the wire. Morgan sat in the noise and the smell of fuel, feeling the faint, rapid heartbeat of a blind puppy against her palm, and realized that for the first time in a very long time, she was exactly where she needed to be. Morgan's story isn't just about the grit of a Navy SEAL. It's a testament to the unbreakable bond between soldiers, no matter if they walk on 2 legs or 4. In the darkest rubble, compassion can be the heaviest and most vital gear you carry. If this story of raw survival and unexpected loyalty moved you, please hit the like button, share it with someone who appreciates the true meaning of no one left behind, and subscribe for more deeply human stories from the front lines.